happy National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And for veterans out there, happy early Veterans Day to you. As Katie said, I work for the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. The Burton Blatt Institute is an international disability research law and policy center. And the Institute is named for Burton Blatt, who is a beloved dean at Syracuse and truly a pioneer in the disability rights movement. And we'll talk about Burton Blatt this morning. So today we're going to talk about heroes. So I want to begin by asking you a question. Think about, who are your heroes? You know, the people or the person that maybe helped you see the world differently, to do things you didn't think you could do. Who are those people you admire? So, you know, certainly parents and grandparents and, but think broadly. Who are those people that shaped or changed your worldview? So when I was a kid, my first hero, like a lot of other young boys, was Superman. You know, Superman was invincible, except for that whole kryptonite thing. And he was always there to save the world, just right on time. Well, I'm from Louisville, as you know, and as I started to grow up, my hero became, as it did for many kids from that city, Muhammad Ali. Because Ali was truly the greatest of all time and one of the most significant personalities in our culture. Ali was not only a prize fighter, but he fought prejudice, not only for the color of his skin, but for religious prejudice. And Ali lived by 6 core principles: confidence, conviction, dedication, giving, respect, and spirituality. And despite that public persona, that Louisville lip or that braggadocious Ali, he was really a very humble man if you had the fortune to ever meet him. And I remember when I was, maybe 11 years old, and Ali lost to Joe Frazier in the fight of the century. And I was listening on a transistor radio, and I remember when he lost, I cried. And I cried because I expected Ali to be just as invincible as Superman. So I have a tourism recommendation for you. If you've never been to the Ali Center in Louisville, certainly is worth an afternoon. So who are our heroes today? You know, certainly we can't talk about heroes without mentioning medical staff and doctors and nurses and first responders and epidemiologists and researchers. Those people who have helped develop a vaccine to fight a virus that disparately affects people with disabilities and older adults. So I say our theme today is heroes, and I want to introduce you to some of my other heroes. And these are the heroes and the events that have shaped the disability rights movement. So why is this important? As the great historian and writer David McCullough has said, how can we know who we are and where we are going if we don't know anything about where we have come from, what we have been through, the courage shown, the costs paid to be where we are? That's from McCullough's book, Portraits in His Brave Companions, Portraits in History. And so I use this quote because we need to keep in mind that the disability rights movement has always been one of constant struggle for equality and basic human dignity that so often is denied people. So let's begin with a disability rights timeline. Let's look back over the last 100 years to see where we have come from. In 1917, we see the Smith-Hughes Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And Smith-Hughes was the first act to provide rehabilitation services for disabled veterans returning from World War I. In 1920, the Smith Vocational Rehabilitation Act then extends vocational rehabilitation services to the civilian population. 1933, we see Franklin Roosevelt become the first president with an obvious disability. And I have a book recommendation for you. It's written by Hugh Gallagher, and it's called FDR's Splendid Deception. And it describes the length to which Roosevelt, his son Elliot, and others went to hide or mask FDR's disability for fear of being seen as unable. In 1935, we see the League of the Physically Handicapped form. And the League is formed because, keep in mind the context here, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. Roosevelt has enacted the Works Progress Administration, and yet the Works Progress Administration refused to hire people with physical disabilities. 1938, we see the Fair Labor Standards Act is established, and a lot of good things came out of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Minimum wage, overtime pay, and end to child labor. But there's this peculiar provision thought to help people with disabilities find work, the 14C subminimum wage certificate, that we know, in fact, just keeps people with disabilities in poverty, working for pennies on the dollar in congregate segregated settings. 1940, we see the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped form that we know today as AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities. In 1946, we see the National Mental Health Foundation, which we know today as NAMI. And the National Mental Health Foundation led Truman to signing the first National Mental Health Act. And finally, we need to mention in 1951, an obscure little summer camp in the Catskills, Camp Jened, that would become the epicenter of the disability rights movement in the 1960s and the early 1970s. So if you are one of those very few people who have yet to see the documentary Crip Camp, please do so. It's an absolute must-see documentary. Moving on to more modern times, 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. But what was missing from the Civil Rights Act are people that would become the largest minority in the country, people with disabilities. 1972, we see a couple of court cases, Mills versus the DC Board of Education and Park versus Pennsylvania. In these cases, obviously regarding public education, but we weren't debating a free and appropriate public education for kids with disabilities, but rather, should kids with disabilities even be educated in the classroom? 1973, we see the Rehab Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in programs of the federal government or programs that receive federal financial assistance. And the Rehab Act then becomes the foundational law for 1990's Americans with Disabilities Act. 1975, we see the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act that we know today as IDEA. 1978, we see the ADAPT bus protests that where people with disabilities shut down transit systems all across the country to demonstrate the inaccessibility of public transportation. 1986, the Air Carriers Access Act then extends protections for people in air travel who have disabilities. 1988, we see I. King Jordan become the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. And this is important. Keep in context that Gallaudet is formed in 1862, 1863, as an institution of higher education specifically for people who were deaf or hard of hearing. It was not until 1988 that Gallaudet had their first deaf president. What a symbol of ableism. 1990, of course, we see the Americans with Disabilities Act signed into law. It's modeled, as I said, after the Rehab Act. And then finally, 1999, certainly one of the most significant court cases in our lifetime, certainly one of the most important cases, civil rights cases ever. Olmstead versus LC, where Lois Curtis sues the state of Georgia. She had lived for many years in a institution, and she was held there without her against her will. And the Supreme Court says in Olmstead versus LC that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities was a violation both of Title II of the ADA and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Here's our first video. It's President George H.W. Bush at the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And now I sign legislation which takes a sledgehammer to another wall, one which has for too many generations separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse but not grasp. And once again we rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America. And now,
so here's a picture at the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We see President George H.W. Bush on the South Lawn. Very warm July day. It was July 26th. And in this picture, we see along with the president, we see Evan Kemp in the tan suit. He was the director of the EEOC at the time. Behind Evan Kemp, we see the Reverend Harold Wilkie. To Wilkie's left, we see Sandra Perino, who was the director of the National Council on Disabilities at the time. And then we see the guy at Bush's left, the guy in the cowboy hat, someone who we will discuss in detail in a few minutes, Justin Dart, the father of the ADA. So it's customary at the signing of a major piece of legislation that the president gives out pens that he used to sign the legislation, right? Well, Reverend Wilkie is born without arms and in a sublime moment receives his pen from the president with his left foot. Isn't that wonderful? What an image. So we can't talk about heroes and we can't talk about disability rights without talking about the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th century is a belief that we can improve the quality of the species by encouraging reproduction of those who are perceived to have positive attributes while discouraging reproduction of people with undesirable traits. Eugenics can be traced back to a guy by the name of Francis Galton in 1883, and Galton, incidentally, was a cousin of Charles Darwin. So where have we heard this idea of genetic superiority before? Well, certainly the Nazis practiced it in the worst and most abominable way, but we need to keep in mind the Nazis got it from us. They got it from the eugenics movement. We can't talk about the Nazis without mentioning that in 1939, the Nazis had begun a program called Aktien T4 that resulted in the murder of between 275 and 300,000 people with disabilities. This predates the concentration camps. And the Nazis are influenced by a study by a guy by the name of Ewald Meltzer. And Meltzer ran a psychiatric hospital in Germany. And he conducted a survey of the parents of the patients who were there at the facility he operated. And in this study, Meltzer was shocked to learn that 73% of parents said that euthanizing their children would be okay as long as they didn't know. Here's our next hero. This is Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was a patient at the Virginia State Colony for the Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. In 1924, Virginia passes the compulsory sterilization law of people with intellectual disabilities on the basis of eugenics. Buck, in the eyes of the state, represented a genetic threat to society. Buck's 52-year-old mother, who also was thought to have intellectual disability, had, in the words of the time, a record of prostitution and immorality. And she had 3 children, according to the records of the time, without good knowledge of their paternity. Carrie Buck was one of those children. She had been adopted. She attended school for 5 years. She made it to 6th grade. And then Buck was sent to the Virginia State Colony after she was deemed incorrigible, promiscuous, and feeble-minded. Why? Because Carrie Buck had given birth to a child out of wedlock. It was later discovered that the child was the result of a rape by her adopted mother's nephew. Buck v. Bell goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Here's a picture of Oliver Wendell Holmes, certainly considered one of the great jurists to ever sit on the Supreme Court. Buck v. Bell goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in an 8-1 decision, the court found that forced sterilization did not violate Carrie Buck's rights for equal protection and due process under the 14th Amendment. There was only one dissenting vote on the court, and that was Pierce Butler. And Pierce Butler voted no, not because he believed that Carrie Buck had protection under the 14th Amendment, but because Pierce Butler was a Catholic. And he did not believe in any sort of birth control, including sterilization. Butler did not even bother to write a dissenting opinion. In the majority opinion, Oliver Wendell Holmes said that permitting compulsory sterilization of the unfit, including the intellectually disabled, for the protection and health of the state did not violate the due process clause. Holmes went on to say, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. And referencing Carrie Buck, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So where did Holmes get this idea, this term imbecile, right? It certainly is a derogatory term, but keep in mind that that term comes from what's called mental age theory, and it's a primary feature of the eugenics movement. It's still with us today. So when Holmes is referring to imbeciles, as this chart suggests, he was using mental age theory in his comments. And a colleague of ours, Ivanova Smith, who is at the University of Washington, Lend, has written an excellent essay on mental age theory, and I recommend it to you. Here's an interesting question for you. When did forced sterilization for people with disabilities end? 1932, 1947, 1966, 1979. Forced sterilization of people with disabilities did not end until 1979. Folks, that's when I was 20 years old. That's in my lifetime. And interestingly enough, there has never been a challenge to Buck v. Bell. So in theory, the Supreme Court has never reversed that decision. Let's move on and talk about a real hero. This is Ed Roberts. He's the father of the independent living movement. Roberts contracted polio 2 years before the Salk and Sabin vaccine was available. He required an iron lung to stay alive. Because he could not complete physical education or driver's training, he at first was denied his high school diploma and had to challenge his high school in the courts. He was first accepted, but then denied admittance to Berkeley in the early 1960s because, in the words of one Berkeley dean, "We've tried cripples, it didn't work." He enters on appeal and advocacy, and vocational rehabilitation then refused to provide tuition assistance for Ed Roberts, determining that there was no reasonable expectation that Roberts would become employed. Roberts and later other people with disabilities came to live on the UC campus, and they lived in a place called Crowell Hall, which had been converted from the campus hospital because it was the only building that was structurally sound enough to allow Roberts to have his iron lung. So while at Berkeley, as we know, has always been a center point of activism, they started attracting more people with disabilities, including those campers from Camp Jened. So Roberts and others form a group called the Rolling Quads to push for greater accessibility in the campus and in the community. So the Rolling Quads then later become the Physically Disabled Students Association, advocating for greater campus and community access. So Roberts graduated from Berkeley. He teaches for a while, and he forms this concept of independent living centers that are run by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. He's considered the father of the independent living movement. And this model has been replicated worldwide. And in a moment of sublime kismet, remember, VR had refused to provide him tuition assistance. In 1976, Roberts becomes the director of California vocational rehabilitation. Isn't that wonderful? Here's some video of Ed Roberts.
Contracted polio. After months in the hospital, Roberts returned home paralyzed from the neck down and began the difficult transition into a new life.
First of all, I tried to kill myself.
By not eating.
And you have to be pretty creative when you're paralyzed from the neck down.
You can't even reach out and unplug something.
Right. Well, and you've got all these nurses and doctors trying to save your life. And so the thing that I chose...
Reluctantly sometimes trying to save your life,
yes,
but...
Right.
Yeah.
The thing that I chose was I was not hungry. I starved myself.
Roberts ultimately chose to live. He returned to school and began to see the need to advocate for himself as a person with disabilities. He challenged and won against his high school administration when they claimed he could not graduate due to his not taking physical education or driver training. He also challenged the California Department of Rehabilitation and admissions personnel to gain admission to UC Berkeley in 1962. These experiences shaped Roberts and directed him towards advocating for independent living for the disabled.
Think about your own life. If you had people taking care of you, making all your decisions, what is there to life, really? And almost all the social programs we set up take care of us, or put us away in institutions to be cared for. And I think once I began to discover that, how important it is to help yourself and to move on from that and to go beyond what people thought my limits were.
At UC Berkeley, Roberts studied political science and further developed as a proponent for the civil rights of the disabled. He pushed for the right of achieving personal independence. In 1972, he helped found the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, a revolutionary approach to advocacy for the disabled. Organizations such as this are run by the disabled, and they help clients maintain their daily lives. They work with local governments in promoting accessibility in public spaces and in helping clients develop careers.
What we are is not super cripples, but we are role models. We are examples of people who, even with the most severe disabilities, have been able to lead fulfilling lives in the community and work, have families, and overall play significant roles.
He also advocated for greater accessibility in public spaces, pushing for the adoption of curb cuts and sidewalks as policy.
He invented curb cuts. We always tested curb cuts, me and him. I was either riding in his chair, but how sloped was the curb cut? How much of a drop off was there at the end? My father had about 8 inches between his battery cell and the ground. If that curb cut wasn't right and it was cut off and down, he was going to slam the back of his chair. I mean, curb cuts, completely utilitarian. The greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Roberts helped found the World Institute on Disability in 1983. In raising awareness on the philosophy of independent living, he traveled to Russia, Australia, Japan, and France to advocate for public policy changes. Roberts passed away in 1995 at the age of 56. His influence continues to be felt nearly 20 years later, as centers for independent living based on his model have opened across the United States and across the world. He is memorialized in places such as the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California, and on Ed Roberts Days adopted by the state governments of California and Minnesota.
You can't go wrong with your gut. You can't go wrong with your passion. Don't ever settle. He never settled. I'll never settle. I carry that with me every day. And if there's anything he'd love to pass on, it's just go for it. Follow your passions. If that's in the independent living movement, then go for it. Don't settle. Fight for what you want and what you believe in. That's what my father would want.
Let's move from Ed Roberts to the Rehab Act. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was originally vetoed by Richard Nixon as being too costly or unenforceable. As I mentioned before, the Rehab Act is the foundational law for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And 3 important sections of the law to consider. Section 501, that prohibits disability discrimination in government hiring. Section 503, that prohibits discrimination in hiring by contractors and subcontractors of the federal government. And also Section 504 that says programs that receive federal funds cannot discriminate on the basis of disability. Now, keep in mind the Rehab Act is going to factor into an event that we are going to discuss in a few minutes, certainly the watershed event of the disability rights movement. There are some additional amendments to consider. 1978, we see the Centers for Independent Living amendments to the Rehab Act. 1986, supported employment, since we are hosted by the Supported Employment Training Project today. 1986, supported employment becomes part of the Rehab Act. And then in 1992, that employment would become the primary goal of vocational rehabilitation programs. Here's our next hero. Here's someone whose work should be very important to you. Years before the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, before Mills versus DC Board or Park versus Pennsylvania, there's a teacher in Los Angeles that believed his students with disabilities had hidden potential that was unseen due to the significance of their disability. This is Mark Gold. He believed that anyone could learn and that it was our role to figure out how to teach them. Gold comes up with a concept, with a theory. It's called try another way. And while at the University of Illinois, Gold devises this method of what we know today as systematic instruction to teach people with the most significant impact of disability to perform the most complex tasks. The training was called Try Another Way. And this is a quantum shift because it moves the service system from a custodial care to an instructional model of service. Gold's belief was that people with significant disabilities should have dignity and control of their lives. Systematic instruction is the foundation of what we do in supported employment, in teaching people how to perform these complex tasks. Systematic instruction provides a framework for organizing what needs to be learned, how to provide feedback and motivation, and it's based on treating the learner with dignity. Here's some video of Mark Gold.
This is a bicycle brake. Since 1967, when we began this research, it has had a major impact on the development of my philosophy and on the techniques that have generated from our research. Its principal impact has been to point out the discrepancy between what people think are the capabilities of the severely handicapped, the mild and severely and profoundly retarded, and what they're really capable of doing. The hundreds of people that we've trained on this task, almost 100% of the time, have learned quickly and efficiently to do this. If they can learn to do this task which in and of itself means nothing at all, certainly many of the things that we have kept from them, complicated things to learn, we think, many of those things are things that they could learn, things that would allow them to join us as thoroughly participating members of society. This is Barbara. She's 19 years old and for the last 11 years has lived in an institution. According to her records, her IQ is 11, whatever that means. She's working with this task and with me for the first time. She's more talkative than a lot of the people we work with. It's a pleasure to work with people like this because you can see the growth so fast. You can see changes in their dignity, in how they approach the task, how they feel about training. You listen to her complaining here, and yet her hands are cooking. Why can't the people we serve have their balances too? Why can't we give them genuine competence? Why can't we give them things that not everyone else has? The answer is that we can. As soon as we decide that they have the right to acquire really sophisticated, genuine skills, social skills, self-help skills, academic skills, etc., then they can have the same chunk of the action that we have.
As I mentioned before, I worked for the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and Burton Blatt was a great scholar, dean of the College of Education. And in the winter of 1965, he and a fellow by the name of Fred Kaplan found their way into state institutions in New York. And they photographed using literally cameras on their belts to photograph the atrocities they saw there. And keep in mind the historical context of this. It was only a few months before that Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General, had toured the institutions. And Kennedy said, I think that state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think that particularly Willowbrook, we have a situation that borders on a snake pit. The children live in filth, and many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously. This must have been a tremendous impact on Kennedy when you keep in mind that his sister Rose had been living in an institution for the past 25 years when he made that statement. So Burton Blatt and Fred Kaplan have this photographic expose, and it's called Christmas in Purgatory. And it is a difficult book to find, but certainly one that is worth seeking out. And here's some images. Here are some images from Christmas in Purgatory. So my job in the early 1980s was to negotiate with state institutions across the state of Kentucky to liberate people with disabilities and return them to their home communities. And many of the institutions at the time were very similar to what Burton Blatt and Fred Kaplan saw. So let's move on to our next hero. This is Roland Johnson. Roland Johnson is a man born with intellectual disability, and he's sent to the Pennhurst State Asylum at the age of 12 after suffering abuse at home from his mother for behavior that she just really didn't understand. When Pennhurst opened in 1908, it was called the Eastern State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. By the time Johnson was sent to the institution, it was already well overcrowded and understaffed, with 2,800 people with disabilities in prison there. Roland Johnson is liberated from the facility, and he becomes the president of a group called Speaking for Ourselves, where he encourages other people with intellectual disabilities to fight for their own rights and the rights of others. So here's a picture of Roland Johnson receiving an award from President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. Roland Johnson was present on the lawn July 26th of 1990 when the ADA is passed. Roland Johnson died young at age 48 in a house fire. And Nancy Thaler, who is the Pennsylvania Office of Developmental Programs, was quoted as saying, "It's impossible to know the courage of a man who had slung at him the worst labels and insults imaginable, who suffered abuse and neglect, who belonged to a group totally discounted by society, but who nevertheless stood up in public to speak for himself and for his people. Roland Johnson gave voice to those people. Roland made us listen. Roland changed how we think about disability." Now we're going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, one of my favorite people. Fannie Lou Hamer sits at the intersection of ableism and racism. Fannie Lou Hamer became an important voice in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. She was an individual who had polio, and she worked both as a sharecropper and then later as plantation timekeeper, because she was the only one of the very few people on the on the plantation that was literate. She lived on the Marlowe plantation for most of her entire life. And in 1961, she was inspired by a meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to take up the cause of voter repression in Mississippi. She tried herself to register to vote, and the clerk gave Hamer a test where she had to interpret a section of the state constitution dealing with de facto laws. And Hamer is quoted as saying, "I knew as much about de facto laws as a horse knows about Christmas Day." So needless to say, she failed the literacy test. She returns to the Marlowe plantation. And of course, word spread before she even returned home that she had tried to register to vote, and she was fired. Fannie Lou Hamer is best known for challenging voter suppression and founding what's called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is formed to challenge an all-white Mississippi delegation at the 1964 Democratic Convention. So she's getting ready to testify before the credentialing committee. There were other speakers there as well. Dr. Martin Luther King, Rita Schwerner, the wife of Michael Schwerner, who was just killed 2 months earlier. You might recall the movie Mississippi Burning dealt with Schwerner's death. So Lyndon Johnson is terrified, not of those other dignitaries in the room, but he's terrified of Fannie Lou Hamer, who can speak from firsthand the terrors that she had encountered in Mississippi jails, So what does Johnson do? He hastily calls a bogus news conference. Just as Fannie Lou Hamer begins her televised testimony to take the spotlight off of her. Fannie Lou Hamer was noted by Dr. Martin Luther King when he accepted his Nobel Peace Prize, thanking her for her discipline, her wise restraint, and her courage. So in yet another example of eugenics, Hamer is involuntarily sterilized. And in 1963, while returning to her home in Rouville, Mississippi from Indianola, she's nearly killed in a Mississippi jail at the hands of the police. And here's some video with Fannie Lou Hamer.
And they, you know, when I walked in with the two white men that had carried me down, and they cursed me all the way down. They would ask me questions, and when I would try to answer, they would tell me to hush. And when I walked inside of the booking room, one of the policemen went over and jumped up on one of the Negroes' feet that was with us, and then they just began to, you know, put us in cells. And I was put in a cell with Miss Evesta Simpson, and after I was put in this cell, I could just hear some horrible screams and horrible sounds, you know, of licks. And I saw one of the girls was 15 years old, was with us, and she passed my cell, and she was real bloody. And then they asked the little man that cleaned up the jail to go inside and mop up that blood. And then I heard some more screaming, and I heard some awful sounds. And I would hear somebody when they say, "Can't you say yes, sir, nigger? Can't you say yes, sir?" And they would call her names that I wouldn't want to go on tape. And she said, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So I said, and she said, "I don't know you well enough." And I would hear when she would hit the floor again. And finally she began to pray, and she asked God to have mercy on these people because they didn't know what they was doing. And after a while they passed my cell door with this young woman, Miss Annelle Ponder, and one of her eyes looked like blood, and her hair was standing up on her head, and her clothes had been torn from the shoulder down to the waist. And then 3 white men came to my cell, and one of them was a state highway patrolman because he was wearing a little silver plate across his pocket that said John L. Bassinger. And he asked me where I was from, and I told him I was from Rouville. And he said, "I'm going to check that." And he went out, and I guess he called Rouville. And they didn't like me in Rouville because I worked with voter registration there. And when he came back, he said, "You damn right." They said, "You're from Rouville, all right, and we gonna make you wish you was dead." And they led me out of that cell into another cell, and he gave a Negro prisoner a blackjack, and he ordered me to lay down on a bunk bed. And a Negro prisoner said, "Do you want me to beat her with this, sir?" And he said, "You're damn right, because if you don't, you know what I'll do for you." And I laid down on the bunk like he ordered me to do. And the first Negro beat me. He beat me until he was exhausted. And after he beat, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. And during the time he was beating, I began to work my feet because that was a horrible experience. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro that had beat to sit on my feet while the second one beat. And I just began to scream where I couldn't control it. And then the white man got up and began to beat me in my head. I have a blood clot now in the artery to the left thigh and a permanent kidney injury on the right side from that beating. These are the things that we go through in the state of Mississippi, just trying to be treated like a human being.
Fannie Lou Hamer died young from complications from the beating she experienced. Here's Fannie Lou Hamer's tombstone. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. Here's our next hero. This is Judy Heumann, truly one of the greatest champions of the disability rights movement. She helped draft the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, now IDEA. She was a colleague of Ed Roberts and a founding member of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. Along with Roberts, she founded in 1982 the World Institute on Disability, a nonprofit group that works to integrate people with disabilities into communities around the world. In 1993 to 2001, she served for the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services. She also has served for the World Bank as the first advisor on disability and development. And she was one of those campers at Camp Jened that spurred her activism in the disability rights movement. And she was present at that watershed event that I mentioned we're going to discuss in a moment. And if you ever listen to our ADA Live podcast that's produced by Southeast ADA Center, listen to episode 81, where we have an interview with Judy. And I have another book recommendation for you. It's called Being Human, a book that came out, I think, maybe a year ago that Judy has written. Here's some video of Judy Heumann.
I think the real time when I really had to step forward was when I wanted to be a teacher. My written, oral, and medical exam all were given in inaccessible buildings, so clearly we had no ADA or Section 504 at that time. And my friends carried me up and down the steps. And then I was failed on my medical exam because I couldn't walk. I started getting letters from people, and people would stop me on the street. They wanted to live their life like anybody else. They had significant disabilities, but it was everybody really beginning to demand respect and the right to be able to do with their life what other people do and don't have to think about. Friends of mine and I decided that what we would do is we would take all the people I'd spoken to and letters and invite them to a meeting. And we set up this group called Disabled in Action. So the demonstrations in San Francisco were organized through the coalition. We got inside, we weren't getting the answers we wanted. A couple of us said, we shouldn't leave, we should stay. And so people stayed. The most important part of what was going on was really being on top of the negotiations that were happening, working with the press on a regular basis. You'll hear from people how empowering it was for them to be taking a stand. That was really the beginning of advocacy. For the younger people today, I want them to have a vision which is dramatic, that really allows them to look at making the same degree of changes.
So I've alluded to it a couple of times. The watershed moment of the disability rights movement occurred in April of 1977, when over 150 people with disabilities occupied the federal building in San Francisco for 28 days. The occupation was the longest occupation of a federal building in the history of our country. They were there because Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, a guy by the name of Joseph Califano, had refused to implement the rules for Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And you might remember 504 says that if you have a disability, you cannot be discriminated against in any program or service that receives federal funds. So here's a video of the occupation.
For the times they are a-changing.
We were there because we had to be there.
We weren't going to take it anymore.
We had to have our civil rights. And they decide to fight for them on April 5th, 1977. Proud and defiant, 500 to 600 people in wheelchairs with walking canes and hearing aids storm the regional office of Health, Education, and Welfare in San Francisco. Their purpose? To stop discrimination against the disabled, no matter what the consequences.
Our role that afternoon was to ask the people in the federal bureaucracy to call Washington and press for the signing of 504 as drafted.
For the disabled, the signing of Regulation 504 is the difference between living and existing.
We're more than handicapped without these laws. We're crippled.
504 means access to public transportation and public spaces. It means free public education and no job discrimination. All basic American civil rights, unless you're like Mary Jane Owen, who cannot see and cannot hear without an aid.
The general attitude was, you don't really know what's best for you, and we will do what is right over time. When? We're tired. When?
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.
For thousands of disabled people across the nation, the answer is now. In a grassroots movement, they stage a sit-in at 10 HEW offices across the country. In Washington, protesters put newly appointed Secretary Joseph Califano on the hot seat, demanding he sign 504.
I understand how you feel.
No, you don't.
Within 24 hours, the demonstrators are forced out of the federal buildings, everywhere that is, except San Francisco. Instead of giving in, they move in what will become the longest occupation of a federal building in U.S. history.
I had a moment of, do I really want to do this? I mean, I was thinking of, some of the things that had gone on in the 60s and the fire hoses and the mace cans, and I thought, well, it didn't have that kind of a feeling.
Nevertheless, officials try to sabotage the demonstration.
The biggest thing was that malicious unplugging of motorized wheelchairs at night.
Those kinds of things did nothing but make us stronger.
We're speaking of something that goes beyond our bodies. Our priorities are not comfort. Our priorities are justice.
We shall not be moved.
The community rallies behind the demonstrators as the days pass. The Black Panthers send in cold sandwiches. Others bring in mattresses and a portable shower.
The restrooms here are far from accessible to disabled people. They have towel holders that you have to be Wilt Chamberlain to hit.
1 week into the takeover, some of the demonstrators decide to hammer the point home. They go on a hunger strike.
I'm trying to embarrass President Carter in a hunger strike. However, attendant to that is a bit of diarrhea.
Yet their spirits are intact. Each morning, Jeff Moyer leads the protesters in song. No amount of singing will change Califano's mind. Ramps and services cost money, lots of it. He has to convince schools, hospitals, and transportation systems to spend it.
It doesn't do any good to put out a set of rules if nobody's going to follow them, or somebody's going to go to Congress and say, well, I'll get them repealed or changed.
2 weeks pass. The deadlock continues. Meanwhile, the difficult living environment is jeopardizing the health of several demonstrators.
I'm a spinal cord injury. Someone must turn me during the night. Well, often it must be done by a person who has no experience in turning me. It's very painful. There's very little rest at the end of a night.
If one of us got weak, then the others gathered around and gave us strength. So we never lost sight of why we were there.
How can you ask if I'm happy going my way? You might as well ask a child to play.
Just sharing in the ups and the downs.
No need to discuss
It was just powerful.
Powerful enough to cause change, if not politically, then personally. Mary Jane Owen remembers one young woman's wish.
If you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said, I wish I didn't have to be crippled anymore, because I always wanted to be beautiful and I didn't want to be crippled. And she said, now I know I'm beautiful. Now I know I'm beautiful as I am.
I won't ask of myself to become something else. I'll just be me.
We're just people. Humanity should recognize itself, not its differences.
If your eye on the prize. Hold on.
Hold on, they do. 21 days, 26 days. Then, finally, 28 days later, the prize at last is theirs. The signing of 504, a victory worth fighting for. In the words of Mary Jane Owen,
I can see.
Keep your eye on the prize and hold on.
Folks, we are about out of time. I hope you can stay with me. We're getting near the end, I promise. Here's our next hero. This is Brad Lomax. Brad Lomax is the guy using the wheelchair in this picture, and he's next to his brother Glenn. And the occupation of the federal building in San Francisco would not have been possible without support from the outside. It included the International Association of Machinists, the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez's group, and most importantly, the Black Panthers, who provided one meal a day during the occupation. And Brad Lomax was a member of the Black Panthers and a founder of the East Oakland Center for Independent Living. And he was one of the protesters at 504, or of the 504 occupation, and made sure that everyone got a meal a day. Would not have been possible without Lomax. Here's the chief architect of the legislation that became the ADA. This is Senator Tom Harkin. And Tom Harkin's activism is the result of love for his brother Frank. Frank Harkin was deaf after contracting spinal meningitis. And in his Senate speech in support of the ADA, Harkin gave his speech in both English and American Sign Language. Senator Harkin was, again, our ADA Live podcast. He was our guest for episode 70, talking about the history and the future of the ADA and the discrimination personally that his brother Frank had experienced. 1999, we mentioned the Olmstead decision earlier. Certainly one of the most important court cases in the history of disability rights. The Supreme Court ruled that forced institutionalization violated Title II of the ADA and the 14th Amendment. And at the center of the Olmstead decision is Lois Curtis. Lois Curtis, who at age 11 had intellectual and developmental disabilities, had been sent to live at the Georgia Regional Hospital. She lived there for 18 years. And here's a picture of Lois Curtis. After she was liberated, she became, and it still is today, a well-known artist. Here she is presenting one of her paintings to Barack Obama. I first had the idea that I wanted to do a presentation like this in the spring of 2019. And Katie and I, along with Nancy Buteau, we were doing a training in Pompano Beach, Florida. And in these trainings, this is, pre-pandemic, right, in person. So I like to ask questions and give away some of my boss's books. And I asked a group of 200 people in the room who the guy was in the cowboy hat at the signing of the ADA. And nobody knew. I was floored that the guy in the cowboy hat is, of course, the greatest hero of them all, Justin Dart. Justin Dart was somebody who was born of privilege. His mother was the heir to the Walgreens drug fortune. His father was the president of Rexall Drugs. Dart had earned his teaching degree at the University of Houston, but the university refused to give him a teaching certificate due to his physical disabilities. So Dart went on to become the president of Tupperware in Japan, where he began a policy of hiring women and people with disabilities. The Tupperware executives in the US told him to stop this disability nonsense. So Dart quit. Dart comes back to the United States, where he and his wife, Yoshiko, begin a listening tour to record stories of disability discrimination, and those stories became the impetus for the ADA. So, whenever you give a talk like this, you try to leave your audience with a meaningful call to action, something inspirational. But nothing could end this time with you today that would be any more powerful than Justin Dart's farewell as he was dying.
Dearly beloved, listen to the heart of this old soldier. As with all of us, the time comes when body and mind are battered and weary. But I do not go quietly into the night. I do not give up struggling to be a responsible contributor to the sacred continuum of human life. I do not give up struggling to overcome my weakness, to conform my life, and that part of my life called death, to the great values of the human's dream. Death is not a tragedy. It is not an evil from which we must escape. Death is as natural as birth. Like childbirth, death is often a time of fear and pain, but also of profound beauty, of celebration of the mystery and majesty which is life pushing its horizons toward oneness with the truth of Mother Universe. The days of dying carry a special responsibility. There is a great potential to communicate values in a uniquely powerful way. The person who dies demonstrating for civil rights. Let my final actions thunder of love, solidarity, protest, of empowerment. I adamantly protest the richest culture in the history of the world, a culture which has the obvious potential to carry a golden age of science and democracy dedicated to maximizing the quality of life of every person, but which still squanders the majority of its human and physical capital on modern versions of primitive symbols of power and prestige. I adamantly protest the richest culture in the history of the world, which still incarcerates millions of humans with and without disabilities in barbaric institutions, back rooms, and worse, windowless cells of oppressive perceptions for the lack of the most elementary empowerment supports. I call for solidarity among all who love justice, all who love life, to create a revolution that will empower every single human being to govern his or her life, to govern the society, and to be fully productive of life quality for self and for all. I do so love all the patriots of this and every nation who have fought and sacrificed to bring us to the threshold of this beautiful human dream. I do so love America, the beautiful, and our wild, creative, beautiful people. I do so love you, my beautiful colleagues in the disability and civil rights movement. My relationship with Yoshiko Dart includes, but also transcends, love as the word is normally defined. She is my wife, my partner, my mentor, my leader, and my inspiration to believe that the human dream can live. She is the greatest human being I have ever known. Yoshiko, beloved colleagues, I am the luckiest man in the world to have been associated with you. Thanks to you, I die free. Thanks to you, I die in the joy of struggle. Thanks to you, I die in the beautiful belief that the revolution of empowerment will go on. I love you so much. I'm with you always. Lead on, lead on.
Let us embrace each other in reverence for individual human life. Let us go forward together for however long it takes to create an America that empowers all.
So those are my heroes. Thank you all for spending this time with me this morning. I apologize for running a few minutes over. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Kentucky APSI. Thank you, the Supported Employment Training Project. And I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thank you so very much, Barry. You are getting lots of feedback in the chat box this morning, and thank you for taking the time to put this together was one of the comments, because there's a lot of information, and as many of you noted on there, it's no matter how much we think we might know, we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. So thank you for sharing this information, and I did have the opportunity to see it the first time you presented it, and maybe once or twice since then, and it has changed as you've added more and more and more to it. And so it did go a little bit over. Thank you so much for all 100 of you for hanging on. I did put an evaluation link in the chat box. If you want to scroll up through all the nice comments and find that, I will email it out as well, along with the link to get your certificate. We did record this training, and so we will have it captioned and then posted on the Human Development Institute's YouTube channel, I think is where it will go, but I will send that link out when it's ready to everyone who registered for this event. So thank you all again very, very much for being here. I will put the certificate link in if you want to wait a second, if you need that. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.